other than that, I think we're going to accomplish a lot, and I expect to. And I think our primary focus will be trade and trade with Canada, and I'm sure we can work something out. Yeah.
Well, just last hour, Prime Minister Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump said they are aiming to reach a trade and security deal within 30 days.
It happened quietly, behind closed doors, away from the media flashes. At the G7 summit in Alberta, President Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney met face-to-face. No aides, no cameras, just two leaders, one known for tariffs, the other for tactics. And then came the breakthrough. A trade and security deal between the U.S. and Canada will be finalized within 30 days. It's more than a handshake. It's a pivotal shift in a global summit marked by division, silence, and stalled diplomacy. And it puts one man, Donald Trump, firmly back at the center of it all.
What do we know about that sit-down?
Well, we know that it started with a one-on-one, true one-on-one. No one else in the room, just Trump, just Carney for 30 minutes.
They met for 30 minutes in total privacy. No advisors, no distractions. Then they brought in their teams for over an hour of high-stakes discussion on trade and border security. The tone? Surprisingly warm. Trump didn't hold back. "I'm a tariff person," he said. "It's simple, it's precise." Carney, he noted, had a more complex idea, but also very good. That alone marked a shift. Trump rarely concedes ground in public, let alone praise his counterpart. More than words, symbolism mattered. Trump wore a US-Canada lapel pin. The two addressed each other by first name. They smiled for the cameras. According to Canadian officials, the session was productive. For a relationship strained by tariffs and retaliations, the significance was clear. The ice is cracking, and the goal is set. A deal in 30 days. Whether that means resolution or just a pause in hostilities remains to be seen.
No, I think it could not have gone better from the Canadian perspective, and it's good for the United States as well.
So why Canada? Why now? There's the domestic pressure. Trump's sweeping tariffs, 25 to 50% on Canadian metals, have triggered Canadian countermeasures, including tourism boycotts and increased trade friction. The Premier of New Brunswick recently raised concerns with U.S. governors in Boston, highlighting losses in cross-border business. Then there's the global stage. This year's G7 will not end with a joint communiqué. There's no unity to declare. Each country is going solo, negotiating its own path, and all eyes are on Trump. As leaders scramble for bilateral face time, Canada got there first, and it shows. For Trump, a quick deal with Canada, delivered before the July 4th holiday, could be more than just good optics. It would be proof that his strategy of one-on-one, pressure-based diplomacy delivers results. But that clock is ticking. He's already said, letters outlining unilateral tariffs will go out by July 9th. Countries that don't sign on risk being shut out.
Kind of runway?
Yeah, it's achievable. Both parties have to agree. Yeah, sure.
So what would this 30-day deal include? While nothing is official, the likely pillars are already in plain view. First, tariffs on steel and aluminum, which now hit Canadian exports as high as 50%, including consumer goods like dishwashers and refrigerators. Canada wants these reduced. Fast. Second, critical minerals. The U.S. wants secure access to rare earths, cobalt, and nickel. Canada has the supply and wants long-term guarantees that American buyers won't shift back to China. Third, border enforcement. Trump's administration continues linking immigration control to trade benefits. Joint cooperation on cross-border enforcement is likely part of the conversation. But there's caution in Ottawa. Carney has made it clear. Canada won't rush into a bad deal just to meet an American deadline. That's the balancing act. Find common ground without appearing to concede. No joint statements, no united vision. G7 2025 is fragmented, and the leaders know it. But amid the silence, one deal could still break through. If the US and Canada succeed, it won't just be a trade agreement. It will be a signal that Trump's approach, direct, forceful, personal, is working, at least on his terms. The 30-day clock has started ticking, and for Donald Trump, a deal with Canada may be just the beginning.
We all know the great Prime Minister of the UK, and we just signed a document. This is, sorry about that. This is it. And so we have our trade agreement with the European Union.
At this year's G7 summit in Alberta, Canada, world leaders met to talk about trade, security, and global crises. But one scene quickly stole the spotlight, and it wasn't in the official agenda. Standing side by side, President Donald Trump and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer proudly announced a new trade agreement. Trump held up the signed document for the cameras, but the wind had other ideas. The paper flew out of his hands. Starmer bent down to pick it up. And then, in front of the world press, Trump declared they had just signed a deal with the European Union, which would have made sense if Brexit had never happened. Cameras flashed. The wind picked up. The paper slipped. And without missing a beat, Trump smiled and said, "Little windy out here." Then came the bigger slip. "We just signed our trade agreement with the European Union." Except, it wasn't. It was a bilateral deal between the United States and the United Kingdom, and the UK officially left the EU back in January 2020. Prime Minister Starmer didn't correct him. He simply handed the document back and gave his remarks. Calm, composed, and probably hoping no one would make it a headline. Spoiler, it became the headline. The moment quickly spread online. Some called it harmless. Others saw it as vintage Trump, quick to claim a win, even if the name was wrong.
For British car makers, levies will drop from 25% to 10% for 100,000 vehicles. UK, it still faces 25% tariffs for now, although this is less than the US's global rate of 50% on steel and aluminium.
Lost in the laughter was the fact that a real agreement had just been signed. Under the New Deal, tariffs on British-made cars entering the US will fall from 27.5% to 10%, limited to 100,000 vehicles per year. This gives UK car makers like Jaguar Land Rover better access to the American market. The US will also eliminate tariffs on UK aerospace products entirely. That's a big win for companies like Rolls-Royce and BAE Systems, which are major suppliers in US aviation and defense. In exchange, the UK will lower tariffs on American beef and ethanol. However, British officials have made clear, food safety standards remain unchanged. Hormone-treated beef, for example, is still banned. One sticking point remains: steel. British steel exports will still face a 25% US tariff. That's lower than the 50% rate applied to many other countries, but still a significant barrier. The deal is expected to take effect within 10 days. For Prime Minister Starmer, it's a strong diplomatic achievement early in his term. For Trump, it's another deal signed, with or without getting the name right. Meanwhile, the European Union is still at the negotiation table. According to Reuters and Handelsblatt, EU officials have discussed accepting a flat 10% US tariff, like what the UK agreed to, in exchange for concessions on autos, gas, and pharmaceuticals. But the European Commission has publicly denied that any agreement has been reached. If no deal is signed by July 9th, the US has threatened to raise tariffs to 25 or 50% on EU imports. Brussels has said it will respond proportionally. Compared to the UK's quick, targeted deal, the EU's broader approach is taking more time and facing more friction. So yes, the US and UK signed a meaningful trade agreement. But what the world saw first wasn't tariffs or quotas. It was a gust of wind, a prime minister picking up paperwork, and a president naming the wrong partner. It was part press conference, part political blooper, and it was peak Trump, headline-ready, unscripted, and impossible to ignore. Keir Starmer got a deal. Donald Trump got the spotlight. And somewhere in Brussels, EU officials were likely double-checking their name tags, just in case they got mentioned next.
Come to their side. Trump is known as someone who tends to, he's best approach in a personal level. And so I think we're going to see so much more happen on the bilateral level.
The president has paused tariffs on most countries until July 8th. He says it's unlikely that deadline will be extended.
President Donald Trump has landed in Alberta for the G7 summit. But this isn't just another round of photo ops and diplomatic niceties. This time, Trump arrives with a warning. Trade terms will no longer be negotiated. They'll be delivered. No joint statement. No collective vision. and no illusions about what's at stake. From tariffs and global supply chains to stalled nuclear talks, the G7 has become a stage, and Trump is stepping into it not as a participant, but as the one setting the rules. So the question isn't what the G7 will agree on. It's whether anyone can push back, or whether Trump gets to define the future alone.
But with tariff uncertainty looming over the global economy, most experts are not predicting any major breakthroughs at the G7.
No, it's the prospect of a unified approach to any of these issues has already been thrown out the window because Canada has already said there's not going to be a joint statement at the end of this.
This year's G7 won't end with a joint statement. Canada, the host nation, made that clear even before the summit began. It's not the first time this has happened. Back in 2019, the same decision was made, also under Trump. And in 2025, the reasoning is similar. There's little hope of unified messaging. Instead of collective declarations, the summit will be defined by bilateral negotiations, with each country attempting to steer Trump's attention to its own concerns. But Trump's message is already out. He's not looking for compromise. He's offering each country what he calls their best rate and expects a yes or no by July 8th. Trade, not diplomacy, is taking center stage. Trump has warned that if new bilateral deals aren't reached soon, he will impose unilateral tariffs across the board. The current pause on tariffs is set to expire on July 8th. Trump told reporters, "We'll just send them a letter. If they want a better deal, this is their chance." The proposal? Every country receives a customized tariff rate. Take it or leave it. This approach reflects Trump's broader philosophy: tariffs as leverage, not punishment. He argues that high import duties will push companies to reshore production to the U.S. and rebuild industrial strength. But allies remain unconvinced. European officials say the uncertainty is already freezing long-term investment. Japanese automakers have warned that constant tariff threats make it difficult to plan production cycles. Even within the U.S., business groups are voicing concern. The National Retail Federation, in a June 12th press release, said that sudden changes to tariff rates could raise prices for American consumers, particularly on electronics and home appliances. Meanwhile, several G7 partners are exploring limited workarounds. Some EU officials are reportedly discussing sector-specific deals focused on green tech and rare earths. Japan is pushing to finalize a digital trade framework before the July 8th deadline. But these are still early conversations. According to a DW News report on June 15th, most leaders arriving in Alberta are not expecting breakthroughs. Their priority is simple: manage the pressure, avoid escalation, and keep supply chains functioning. Trump's posture on foreign policy may be less direct, but it still influences the summit. On Iran, he's walked a fine line, denying U.S. involvement in recent airstrikes while warning of unmatched force if attacked. He had previously said a nuclear deal with Iran was close, but since the escalation, that optimism has faded. Talks scheduled for June 15th in Oman were canceled by Iran. On Ukraine, Trump has stayed vague. While President Zelensky urges stronger U.S. support, Trump has made no specific commitments. Still, leaders know these geopolitical flashpoints are tied to economic outcomes, from energy markets to defense spending. They'll try to read between the lines of what Trump doesn't say. This is not a summit about consensus. It's a summit about leverage. Trump isn't asking what the G7 can agree on. He's telling them what deal they can accept, and when. And for the rest of the world, that leaves two options: take the deal or prepare for what comes next.